Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Musing On, where I get to just muse on subjects that interest me outside of the usual Magic the Gathering videos. And I think, as I mentioned previously, because of a series of videos I've done which were very much situated around the state of music in the 90s, and the fact that I'm going to be doing future videos about album releases from each of the years in the 90s. I'm also just getting interested generally in what I was doing then, but what potentially I was exposed to, what I picked up on, what I didn't pick up on. So that could be films, obviously the aforementioned music, but equally it could be things like programming languages, because I was doing quite a bit of programming in parts of the 90s. Well, actually in 3 different places, thinking about it. So I'm going to go through, this may end up into a multi-part video. We'll see how we do in this video. I suppose I should set some sort of timer, maybe. That wouldn't be a bad idea. There we go. And we'll see how far we're going to get. I had a quick cursory look, so I know what's sort of coming up, and I'm only going to pick languages which I have some knowledge of. Either I recognise, or I've worked with, or I've dabbled with, or I've become interested in. We'll see where that takes us. The other thing I wanted to mention, I don't think I've mentioned it in this preamble yet, is I don't know if anybody else out there has like favourite Wikipedia articles. You know, the sort of articles which they find themselves going back to again and again. And I know there's certain types of articles I use a lot, for instance, you know, the ones with album releases, but I'm talking about very specific articles. And definitely this would be very high, if not top of my list, is this timeline of programming languages. I've lost track of how many times I've sort of poured through this and gone off down various rabbit holes. So if you were asking, you know, what was my favourite Wikipedia article of all time, if that question ever came up, it would be this, timeline of programming languages at this point in time. So let's go into the 1990s, see what we've got. So we've got some sort of flavour of basic here. So the first language I recognise is Haskell. However, I haven't got to a point where I've actually learnt Haskell. So I know it, or know of it. So what will tend to happen is languages I'm talking about here are generally going to fall into 3 or 4 categories, which is languages that by some miracle I'm aware of and I used in the same decade. That's quite possible, actually. I think I can see one already, actually, just peeking there, now down the bottom, which is going to fall into that category. Then there's other languages which I didn't learn until a lot later, and I can see another one in there that also is down near the bottom, which falls into that category. And then I suppose the third language is one where I'm aware of the language, it's on my list of things to learn, I'm interested in it, curious, but I haven't actually done any coding in it at all. So yeah, there's about 3. I can't remember, I was trying to think if there was a fourth category of languages. I suppose the fourth category will be languages that I know nothing about at all, and I don't, at this point in time, I don't have any desire currently to learn, maybe. But this falls into category 3. So yeah, I'm aware of Haskell as a language. I've heard it, the term used. I think it might even be the last, is it the last language in the 7 languages in 7 weeks? Possibly. Anyway, let's just have a look at it, even though I haven't used it at all. Yeah, so purely functional language. I was aware that it's used a lot, or I got the impression it's used a lot as a teaching language. So if you're trying to teach someone a purely functional paradigm, I always had the impression that Haskell was the sort of one of the go-to languages. And I think maybe that's when I've seen it, when I've been looking at courses on programming. I suspect that I see Haskell mentioned when they've got a unit on functional programming. It does say the semantics grew out of Miranda, which is another program I am aware of but haven't dabbled with. I was just going to look and see the sort of influenced by, if there's anything here. So yeah, Lisp. Little bit. Played around with that a little bit, but not much. And obviously there's a whole load of languages that it's influenced, which I would have dabbled with, one of which is Clojure, which is a dialect of Lisp. So we got our most recent release. Next formal specification has been planned for 2020. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how up to date this particular article is kept. Strong static type system, apparently. Oh, here's a code example. What have we got here? First line is a type annotation, which is optional. Okay. Interesting structure there. Wonder if you can turn that into a one-liner. I don't know. Oh, this is cool. So we've got, yeah, if then else expressions. So I wondered when they were sort of talking about Lisp and functional programming languages. Yeah, so there is a pattern matching method you can use. And then recursion with guards. Okay, there's a method using a list and the product function. Okay. So that's, what do they call it? Oh. Yeah. Most languages have really interesting functions that work on lists of things. And I'm trying to remember the correct term for that. I was looking at the other day when I was sort of trying to get back on the Erlang horse, which I sort of fell off of, which is why I stopped the Learn to Code, Code to Learn series, because I just, my brain sort of locked up a little bit with Erlang, so I'll be returning at some point, but I need some space to get my head around properly the language. So yeah. But I was reading one of the Erlang books the other day, and it was talking about lists, and also parts of the language that you can use on lists. Oh yeah, using a fold. Okay, so yeah, there's several things here that just, I wouldn't say remind me, but I'm having Erlang flashbacks. Oh, here we go. So we got the implementation of the quicksort. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And anybody that's sort of studied programming languages, more than one will notice there's this sort of go-to examples that get come up a lot. So things like factorial, Fibonacci sequence is another one. Quicksorts. I find them particularly useful if you're trying to cross-compare languages, and I think everybody's probably got their favourite set of little functions that are worth trying out in a new language just to see how they look structurally, those sort of things. So yeah, definitely on my list of something to look into, but I'm not quite sure when at the moment. I wouldn't fancy revisiting Clojure again. I did spend a couple of months several years ago kicking the tires on Clojure, and I wouldn't mind going back to that. Probably be quite helpful actually. Get me in a sort of functional frame of mind. So a quick look at the official website. What I will do is anything I've spoken about or gone down in this particular episode, I will include links in the description to like some useful resources, things for learning the languages. And going forward, for some languages, I'll probably do like special episodes, not necessarily as part of it's going to be an extension of Musings on. I think I'm going to call it something like, what was it now? Reasons, and that was the title I came up with. So basically the idea is to go through, so pick a language, or reasons and resources. So pick a language, give like say 5 reasons for learning that programming language, and then 5 resources to go with that. But that's a bit further down the line. Okay, so yeah, I'll definitely include a link to this. Okie doke. Let's try and get a bit clever here, shall we? So I can accumulate links as we go along. I always like the duplicate feature, because what it also does is duplicate the history as well. So if you need to go back. Okay, so let's try and find one. I don't think I'll go down Oberon is an interesting language, but it's not one that I've really got any desire to learn. I have heard of it, and it's one in which Nicholas Worth was involved, and he's been involved in a number of languages from what I remember, one of which was Haskell. Yep. There's several languages listed there. So yeah, as you can see, at some point in the past I've been here before. So yeah, Python. I didn't learn it in the 90s. I didn't learn it until probably well into the 2000s, I suspect, and as late as the 2010s. So yeah, and that was done just for fun. It wasn't done off the back of... there might be some languages I'm going to talk about here which were done as a result of me doing a specific project or doing a course. In fact, I do know there's at least one language on here which I did as a result of a formal undergrad course, which I'll talk about when I get to it. But Python was just one of those languages where I thought, yeah, I should think about learning this. And for a long while, and probably still now, it is my sort of go-to language if I just want to fiddle around with an idea and, just run it out in Python, like prototype it. I went through a period of time using like Jupyter notebooks a lot to just get out ideas out of my head, and then at some point I'd either switch to a different language or switch to a different, like an IDE, stuff like that. And I'm trying to think, when has it got the release things here? Because there was this big thing about, there's a lot of people like dragging their heels between, what was it, 2.7 and version 3, and I know I had a bit of problems initially because there was one thing in particular I was interested in doing in Python, and at the time when I was doing it, they didn't have a comparable library in, what was it, Python 3 at that time. So I was sort of stuck in learning sort of in both worlds, I suppose. There was stuff I wanted to do where there were just better libraries at the time in 2.7, but I really wanted to do them in 3, just because I wanted to learn the more recent one. But it took quite a while. There was, obviously, because there were so many libraries written for 2, and it took a while for all that stuff to get ported over or get done or redone in 3. So when does it say the end of life was initially 2015, then postponed to 2020? Yeah. So this is, obviously a problem. And it was interesting because when I came to learn, I'm trying to think of the last language I learnt before Erlang. I think it might have been Scala. There seemed to be a thing there. I don't know if it's quite a similar problem, but a hesitancy when the language went to the next version number, and there were some quite major changes in the language, and that can raise all sorts of interesting issues nowadays. It's interesting to see if you're using any form of like code suggestion using AI. You do run into some interesting Frankenstein code gets suggested with languages, particularly where the language has two very large code bases out there, and you end up with these this sort of hybrid Frankenstein version of code which has elements of the old and elements of the new, and it's interesting. The problem is, until you get familiarity with the language and you've learned that outside of using a code suggestion tool, you may not spot that's the case. It really depends, I suppose, on what sort of IDE you're using, how forgiving it is, what sort of linter you might have built in there, those sort of things. I must admit, if I'm using an IDE now, I do tend to switch on a lot of the bells and whistles, not in terms of code suggestion, but just in terms more of so not in terms of auto coding, because I find that a little bit irritating, but in terms of telling you when you've done something like syntactically incorrect or it could cause you a problem. So I tend to have a lot of that switched on. And I know I spent ages like refactoring Scala code when I was learning it, which at first was really irritating, but then as I did it more, it actually turned into its own learning exercise. Yeah, but with Python, the biggest problem I had was with just there was, like I said, there was libraries I wanted to use, and then, okay, well, I can't do this in 3 yet because there isn't a library for this version, so I've got to do it in 2 just because I wanted it to work, and then later on go out looking for alternatives. But I would definitely suggest, if you're already coding and you haven't learned Python yet, it's worth learning, I think. And certainly, what happened for me was initially I just learnt it. I basically wanted to. I had some code that I'd done in Java, which was So let me try and explain this. In fact, I don't know if anybody watching the channel used to interact with me back when I had a music blog, but I had something that I jokingly used to call the method, which was a way of discovering new music, and it leveraged certain services like Last.fm and I'm trying to think of the other music service. Is it about? It's gone anyway, but certainly to some degree Last.fm, and I used to do it manually. And I used to talk about the so-called method, the method in inverted commas, in my blog, and I would use it to generate, the premise was that you had to take a band, and using the method, you get 10 other bands and 10 albums, an album each from those 10 bands, and that produces a really interesting album listening list. So it was leveraging Last.fm to get the band suggestions for similar bands, and then the second website, whose name I've forgotten, to get the album suggestions. And I wanted to automate that. So I learned how to interact with the Last.fm API, and first pass I used Java, and I used, I think it was NetBeans. I think that was the IDE I used to build it. So it actually had a Windows interface. But in order to achieve that, I had to exclusively use Last.fm for everything, which wasn't a problem, but it's just the other website that I used for the album lookups didn't have an API. So I did the band lookups through the Last.fm API, and then for each of the bands I did, the most popular album lookups. So I'd done that already, and then on a whim I decided to convert it, to port it over into Python. And I think initially like version 2 or 2.7 or whatever, and then moved it over to version 3. I think with that one, I can't remember how reliant I was on Python libraries. I don't think I was, so there was a few things I'd use libraries for, but I think I'd actually just written my own API, code to interact with the API anyway, so that wasn't a problem. It was more when I started dabbling around with Twitter. I think there was a specific Twitter library at the time that was really good, and there was one in 2.7, but there wasn't anything as good in 3 at that point, and then over time that changed. So I think the first major piece of code I wrote was that programming version of the method, and then over time, in some ways, that's become one of my sort of go-to programs to try, if I'm feeling confident in another language, is to then try and do that same problem in another language using the same API, using the Last.fm API, but just obviously writing my own functions to interact with the API in a particular language I'm working in. And then after that, what happened was there was a number of data science courses that I did where Python was a requirement. you basically had to learn it for one of the units. So there was a course I did with Microsoft in the early days of Coursera, which was a data science course, and that had, like, I think at least 2 Python units in it. And then again, when I did those courses that were part of the CS50 group of courses from Harvard, also on. So they were on edX. I'm trying to think whether the Microsoft ones were on edX or Coursera actually. Anyway, the Harvard ones are on edX, and there was a Python course on that as well. And I'm in Python there. So yeah, I've done it both. Just so initially I learnt it, taught myself using actually internet resources. I only recently, just for my software, my development library, I only recently bought a Python book actually. But prior to that, I'd done everything through either courses or reading about it online. Like most things, there's a ton of resources out there for learning languages, so not really a problem. Again, I include links to this. I mean, we go to external links. Yeah, official website. Obviously, always a good starting point. I mean, with some, it's easier than others because, as you probably gather, some languages are not open source. So, like, navigating the resources can be a bit more tricky and problematic. So moving on, how are we doing? 25 minutes so far. So maybe we might get to the middle of the year. We'll see how we do. Yeah, there's a few there actually. Maybe I won't get up to 95. So yeah, Visual Basic. Okay, so it's funny, I don't know if anybody else used to really get a kick out of these early, you don't see them though, these complex logos that Microsoft used to use for their programming languages. I used to really love them, just looking at them on the CD, because they used to be on the slipcase on the CD, the booklet, face of the booklet. And the Visual Basic one always sticks in my head. I'm trying to remember. So I definitely, let's go to the timeline because that'll be the most useful. My exposure to Visual Basic came sometime around here, 97, possible. Yeah, it was definitely before I went to work and did like programming full time. At that point, I was still doing programming as like an adjunct to other jobs I was doing as a way of doing process improvement. But it wasn't until, 97 into 98 that I started programming, doing accounts programming for a value-added reseller. And I was doing, I was working not in Visual Basic, but in another, what do you call it, 4GL language, which had a database backend called Concord XAL. But yeah, sometime in, I don't know, it was before then, because I remember getting hold of a copy when I was still working for Radio Rentals, which was from 93 through to sometime in 97. So it might have been 96, 97. And it was before I started writing some VBA stuff as well, which we'll come on to in a moment. So I'm trying to remember whether I would have been using version 4 or 5. It wasn't 3, I don't think. And basically what I did is I didn't have to really learn it for anything particular. I just wanted to learn it. And so what I did, the project I decided to pick was I'd had an implementation of a bacterial identification program which was running in Quick Basic and had been compiled, so it was in well, Quick Basic stroke Q Basic. I can never remember which way round it is. I think Quick Basic is the compiler and Q Basic is the interpreter. And before that, if you're anybody that knows Basic on DOS, remember there was GW Basic. So yeah, GW Basic into Q Basic stroke Quick Basic into Visual Basic. So yeah, I had an implementation of a bacterial identification program that I'd worked on at a previous firm, and so I just decided to port it over to Visual Basic because I wanted to see what it looked like in Windows, because my version was running on, it was like a DOS version, so I wanted to write like a graphical user interface version. And so I spent a few weeks porting the code over and then building the front end. So it probably took as long to actually, use the WYSIWYG to create the forms and everything like that, as it did to actually put the actual code in place to do the heavy lifting in terms of the mathematics and stuff like that, and interacting with the matrix text files, which had all the identification matrices in them. So yeah, that would have been, so according to this, what was it, Visual Basic came out in 91. I used it sometime in the middle of the 90s, I reckon. Yeah. Yeah, this interface, that's funny. I don't know if anybody used it. Remember these? You're sort of starting off with these blank forms. And we'll come on to what it spilt into. Yeah, there was a first Visual Basic for MS-DOS. I don't remember ever using it. Yeah, by the time I started using it was the... Yeah. Was around, like I said, around sometime around here. Yeah, good old ActiveX. It's funny, I always get the warm fuzzies whenever I look at anything like this, particularly this thing. I must have a copy of this on CD somewhere, I reckon. I don't know if anybody remembers that there was a version of Visual C, was it version 1, that Microsoft used to give away free. They had a book I got which was Teach Yourself or Learn Visual C. Was it Visual C++? Anyway, I can't remember exactly. It's on my bookshelf, but my bookshelf and my programming library is actually bizarrely outside of my office. I remember there was a Learn Visual C that Microsoft had released. On the cover it had a copy of Visual C, Visual C++. Maybe I had both. But I didn't get very far with... I sort of taught myself C and C++, but I didn't get very far with the visual version. And I can't remember at this point I don't think at this point it had like the autocomplete on the... I don't know if it did or not when I was using it. You know, when you start typing the names of objects, and it would sort of autocomplete, and you get these sort of drop-down lists where you could select stuff off of it. But it gets incredibly complicated because, of course, as you can imagine, there's all these event triggers that you can trigger code off of. And it can get quite confusing when you're working in it, when you're working with event triggers. But what was nice is the cool thing is that it did provide a really good bedrock for me when I had to learn another 4GL language, because it used a similar coding interface and graphical user interface and had event triggers and all these other things. So yeah, that was super useful, actually learning Visual Basic in preparation for when I had to sort of code full time, even if it was in another language. So we have, Boole and Pascal, which I never really went down a Pascal rabbit hole. Self, which is a implementation, a dialect of Smalltalk. And I did learn Smalltalk in the 90s, funnily enough, when I did my Open University postgrad. I think that was probably the only actual language I learned, because when I did the module in knowledge engineering, we didn't learn an AI language. We learned this wireframe tool for doing for designing knowledge. So it was a tool that was used to do knowledge-based systems analysis and design. So there wasn't really a language as such for that one. So I'm pretty sure the only programming language I learned for one of the modules I did at that point on my computing and manufacturing postgrad was Smalltalk. But I never touched Self. Lua I've heard of but never used, and I definitely need to look at it at some point. I didn't try and learn until a couple of years ago. I bought myself one of those little yellow In Easy Steps books, which back when I was training and teaching people in the 2000s, my go-to book to give complete beginners was the In Easy Steps series. So if anybody said to me, can you recommend any good book on learning Word or anything like that, I'd say, just buy the Word in Easy Steps. And so if there isn't a particular programming in my book I want to buy historically, so often I'll just buy whatever is considered to be the industry standard book for programming languages. So I've got it for my library. I will just find the In Easy Steps book. And so with R, I wasn't particularly worried about buying, say, the industry standard book for R. I just bought R in Easy Steps because I was curious about it, because of my exposure to using Python for data science, and I'd heard that R was also used in data science as well. So I spent a couple of Christmases ago. I bought the book as a Christmas present to myself, and then spent, I think, a week following Christmas going through the book and just learning the rudiments of R. But it's very much, if you've ever used like a notebook interface, it's very much like that, actually. Yeah, but fun to play around with if you like playing with data durdling, as I call it, data munging. It's got this sort of interface here where you sort of put when you sort of greater than sign to indicate the command prompt. So it is basically like working on a command prompt, and you just can fill in the data, obviously load files, do all those things, and then perform manipulations on the data and create functions, and it's pretty cool. I don't know how far down the rabbit hole I went. Did some plotting in it, and you can do things like calculate residuals, coefficients, all the good statistical good stuff. Get things like, it's quite fun to just do the Mandelbrot set, those sort of things. Yeah. Okay. Let's just go to external links. I'm capturing this as I go along. Okay, where are we? Next stop. Okay, yeah, maybe I will. Decisions here. So the trouble is there's so many languages here in 95 I need to talk about. So far what did I talk about? Haskell, Python, Visual Basic. So I'm just going to look ahead a little bit here. When we tackle some of the 95 stuff, maybe I'll just split it in half a little bit. So, ColdFusion. So this I had to learn as part of a course I did in the 2000s. I did a really good web applications development course with the Open University. Took about 3 years, I think, because it was spread out, and I slow rolled it. I took their advice, which they said just do one module per delivery, and I think there were 2 deliveries a year, and it was a 6-module course, and they were writing a lot of the course content as they went along, so it was really up to date anyway, so it wasn't too much of a problem. So by the time I got to the 3rd year, it wasn't that, it was 3 years out of date. So I just slogged my way through it, and I'm pretty sure I think I took 3. I could have taken 2 years. It's funny how you sort of forget, and I can't remember whether there were 3 deliveries of it a year or 2. But anyway, I know, like I said, I only did 1 module per 12-week session. And so as part of, we did several modules which were more on the server side of things. There was this one, which is, we did ColdFusion as part of a unit. I don't know if it was a different unit or the same one. We also covered active server pages as well. But it was interesting to, work in ColdFusion. And as it says here, ColdFusion was originally designed to make it easy to connect simple HTML pages to a database. So it's like this platform. So, it came out in 95. I didn't use it till the 2000s. What would that be, around about probably somewhere in the middle of the 2000s. So it was pretty well developed by then, and has also like a self-contained IDE. And we were interfacing with, basically databases. And as I said, we also at some point learned active server pages, and then later in a unit on open source software, we looked at, I think it was PHP in combination with MySQL, having previously done MySQL before as well in another unit. So we were just looking at another way of doing server-side stuff using open source. Now, I'm pretty sure, back when I did it, it was still a Macromedia product. So that gives me some indication that it was pre-2005. Yeah, because I remember it being Macromedia ColdFusion as opposed to Adobe ColdFusion. But yeah, interesting to dabble in these, like, server-side technologies. And it was nice on the course because we went from client to server-side. So we started off, first unit was on just really mostly about static HTML with some CSS and some JavaScript. And then over the courses, we sort of went into more like server-side JavaScript and, as I mentioned, ColdFusion, active server pages, PHP. I think there was a little bit of, for some reason I got a book on Perl, and I can't remember. I must have been doing some sort of CGI stuff. But yeah, PHP, MySQL, and then the final unit was just about setting up Apache servers, which we'd done a bit on and off then, because in the course of doing the server-side tech stuff, we actually had to set up a server to run locally so we could run the technology as a local instance. They did have like a instance on the web where you could do your development that way if you wanted to, but I just preferred to do development on like a local instance and then push it up, and we had all the tools to do that. But yeah, it's a good course. I can't remember what letters I get. I think it's WAP something. You can see Web Applications Development. No, WAD, that's it. WAD, WAD. Yeah, Cert WAD are the designatory letters I ended up with. Certificate in Web Applications Development. It was really hard though, because all of the units were what they call a level 3. So levels 1 and 2 are sort of undergraduate level, and then level 3 sort of honours and postgrad generally. But it's interesting because it was an undergraduate certificate, not a postgrad. But yeah, for some reason all the course levels were 3, and it was really hard, and lots of people who foolishly doubled up and decided to take 2, even 3 courses simultaneously to get it done real fast were complaining, and everybody in the forums, on the Open University forums, was saying, well, you were warned that it was really hard, the courses were really hard, and there's a lot in them. Each course had like 2 or 3 technologies that you had to learn simultaneously over like a 12-week course, and that's quite tricky. Obviously, like most people on the course are doing it on top of working. So for me, it was a pretty intense period of learning in the 2000s when I finally did it, because I was working for myself, which also incorporated teaching at college, and I was also doing my in-service teacher training simultaneously, and doing the web design course at the same time. So yeah, but yeah, so that's my exposure to ColdFusion. Didn't come until a lot later. Never got around to using it in Anger, actually. The only thing I ever used in Anger were the HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and some PHP, and quite a bit of MySQL over the years. Again, MySQL surfaced again when I had to do some data science stuff, and often at work, in my sort of, when I was doing day-to-day end-user support, some people on the tech side of things would come to me looking for advice about like SQL statements and things like that. Yeah, good old Java. So, as I mentioned, I did start to learn this and wrote at least one program in Java using, I suppose it must have been NetBeans. It was sometime in the 2000s, and I've learnt, I was going to say, like, what other languages have I learnt that use the JVM? and Closure uses the JVM, doesn't it? Yeah, so it's largely influenced by C and C++. I do feel that it would be worth my time revisiting Java, because when I started to learn it, it would have been 2009, 2010, because I remember buying at the time what were the sort of, again, like the industry standard books for Java, and I've not really sort of kept up to date with stuff, and I think it would definitely be worth a visit. What we got? Oh, that's it, Kotlin. Oh, of course, Scala, yeah. That runs on the JVM. So does Closure. Yeah, it's come back to me now. So yeah, Scala runs on the JVM. I didn't know Closure did. Yeah, Kotlin's also on my list. But, you know, I think at a stretch, I've probably, beyond just snippets of code that were written in order to learn it, I think I've probably only implemented, a couple of projects in Java. Yeah, I keep meaning to take a look at live script, but never probably get around to it. I always remember which way round it is. Is it not a it's interesting. Is that a mistake there? No, it isn't. Okay. Oh, okay. So that was the precursor then. So I'm just. I get always a bit confused here. JavaScript, LiveScript, TypeScript. Oh yeah, JScript. Yeah, it's definitely worthwhile learning if you don't know it. If you don't know, there it is again down there. Actually, JavaScript already. I learnt it as part of my web application development course because it was a requirement on that, both in terms of client side and server side. But since then, and apart from well, probably. JavaScript I had to write when I was doing one of the Harvard courses, one of the CS50 courses. That's probably the last time I've written JavaScript. Yeah. And then we go PHP. Yeah, I quite enjoyed learning PHP. Didn't like I say, and another one that was part of the web applications development course in combination with MySQL. In fact, it was quite nice setting this up because at the time I was doing the course, there was quite some nice packages even then, which would sort of bundle together Apache, MySQL, and PHP, so you could set them up fairly easily. And then I also sort of did it individually as well, and even got to the point where after the fact I actually had my own sort of web server space which I set up independently and set up like an Apache server with PHP and MySQL for a short period of time, just because I got really into it and got really interested. And I had a WordPress thing running on there as well for a period of time, just to experiment with like running a server server out in the wild and how to patch it and all those sorts of things. But I just eventually just got rid of it because it, doing all of this stuff where you've got Apache and PHP and MySQL, you obviously have to keep these things patched, and it's a lot of work. Yeah, so I did a little bit of CGI stuff, like I said. That's possibly how I ended up picking up a book on Perl as well. So yeah, PHP from 1995, didn't learn it, like I said, until 2000. Dabbled around a lot. I did one implementation for somebody where they were going to run a like a Apache server in-house, like internally, and run a MySQL database with a PHP front end. But I redid it in Access in the end because there wasn't really any advantage, and they couldn't have the data on the web. It was clinical data anyway, but at the time it's just one of those instances where foolishly I thought, I want to do like a browser-based implementation of something, like a database implementation, and I worked on it for a while and realised, this is just too much work, and ended up rewriting the whole thing one weekend in Access. There you go. So but that was a pretty intense weekend actually. I mean, the good thing was that I'd done, like, a lot of the interface design had already been done, so it was really a question of just getting into the WYSIWYG form design and doing that. We'll come on to the next video I'm going to do. You might have seen there's VBA further down. So so it came out in 95, didn't learn it till the 2000s, didn't use it in anger till the 2000s. Ruby was a funny one. So when I came to Canada, a family member over here, I became aware that they were working in Ruby on Rails, and I got really interested. So I actually went out and bought a Ruby book, a Ruby on Rails book, and then did nothing about it for a number of years. So that would have been the 2010s, I think. And then it wasn't until whenever I started the Code to Learn to Code series that I actually, there's a chapter early on Ruby, and I actually learnt Ruby. Can't remember much of it now. Now, if you're curious, you've got so Ruby on Rails is a server-side web application framework written in Ruby. So you've got this, framework that you can use for Ruby development. But what you can do is you can do Ruby off Rails. You don't have to have the Rails to do it. And when I got around to learning it proper, so when I read the book, obviously it was the Ruby on Rails book, but when I actually got to doing some proper coding, and I was using the 7 languages in 7 weeks, I used off Rails. And I think that was the first time in a little while I'd actually sat down and formally tried to learn a new language. So it's pretty interesting to go through and do that. So a bit of Ruby syntax there. Again, what I'll do is I'll include links. I'm really kept up with myself here. I'll include links to everything I've spoken about in this episode. It was interesting to look through there actually and see how much of stuff I remembered about learning these. I know I did a similar episode before. I sort of went through all the languages which I, formally learned, I think. But still doing this chronologically in terms of when they released is an interesting exercise. Sort of flip it on its head. So where did we get up to? We got up to here. Yeah, I mentioned about JavaScript. So in the next episode when I do this, whenever I get around to doing it, I'll do 96 onwards, I think. Yeah, obviously. To the end, and then we'll talk about a few things that are going to come up there. Okay, thanks once again for watching. Bye for now, and I will catch you in a future episode.